So, yeah, we were just covering a few little ideas and questions and some recap things from yesterday. But what I'm going to take this next step today to sort of talk about is a couple of main elements. I'm going to cover a few things. The notes will cover a bit more. Um, but the idea here is taking some initial steps in the sort of mixing mindset, similar to the way someone would work who was hired to do a mix. And some of those first steps are making some simple level adjustments that sort of like if I'm hired to mix a song, I get the stems and I just sort of start bringing in levels and sort of doing a quick little rebalance. One of the things that I've noticed is that in my own work, it's usually harder to take that step back, but just as useful. So oftentimes I recommend and I try myself, especially if I'm having problems with a mix, like if I'm really fighting something, oftentimes it's useful to take a quick step back and do some sort of just simple rebalancing. Now, the idea behind this is that it's like a mix engineer calls it like a faders up mix, which is basically I'm just putting the faders up. I'm getting a sense of what's there, what the elements are, how things are spread out and what they sound like, and sort of doing a quick rebalance of sort of starting the mix. So sometimes it's useful to be able to do that. Now I know the reality is that most of the stuff that we're working on today is we aren't like we're wearing all three hats, but we're not three separate people in three separate phases. Like back in the day, there was a recording engineer who was responsible for recording all of the different pieces with the microphones and and everything, calibrating the tape. And then there was the mixing engineer, like I'm talking about, and then there was the mastering engineer. And of course, nowadays we're kind of like wearing all those hats and doing it all ourselves. But it is a tip that sometimes when I'm having problems with a mix, to think like a mix engineer and take a step back and just simply rebalancing everything. Turn all the channels off, turn them on one by one, adjust the faders or the level that you want, and sort of rebalance things. Now, the idea behind this is that as we're working, we're doing creative elements and jumping around, right? We might do some drums, might put a drum loop, then maybe have a cool melody idea, and then have like a pad synth to go with that, and then solidify the bass or whatever the order is, doesn't really matter. But the point is that we're constantly doing things. We might take a step back and go, oh, let's do a bass part two here. Let's do a different synth for this lead sound over here. Now let me add a drum loop. Let me change the kick drum, and we're sort of jumping around all the sort of individualized creative elements to make our creative piece fold and work together. And then when the advantage of now thinking like a mix engineer is like all those individual groupings of pieces, like all the different synth parts, all the different bass parts, all the different drum parts are now already created. And so occasionally, like just taking that step back and rebalancing them to one another, now that they're all there and not, working piecemeal as we do in the creative process, it can offer some good insight that can help sort of pull a mix together in a very simple sort of way, just by turning all the tracks off, going one by one, and readjusting the level in that relationship and the relationship of all of those different pieces that work within those different segments. Or I don't want to say like it's groups or instrument categories, right? So like kind of once the creative process is done, you kind of have all the drum parts together, you have all the synth parts together, you got all the vocal parts together, and so sometimes it can be really nice to kind of just do that little re-leveling, especially if I find myself fighting with a mix. I'll be like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to take that step back and do that. So it's a good way to kind of work on this. Another thing that is overall beneficial is to think about adding more headroom while we're working. Um, the way that I approach it is a little bit heavier than what I might than what some people say. But I shoot to try to get about 12 dBs of headroom when I start to mix, because I know that like when I end the mix, I might bring that gain up a little bit. And if I was to send off to master or master myself or whatever with about 10 dBs of headroom, 9 dBs of headroom, that's more than enough for any mastering engineer to work. If I start too loud with less headroom, then I'm going to increase that as I mix. Just the process of, turn up the kick, turn up the snare, turn up the vocal, add a new bass, turn that up. Oh shit, turn up the kick again, right? We've all gone through that. and then we end up looking at our master fader and it's clipping, right? So what I'm saying is that if we start to rebalance the mix with more headroom, then we build the mix together and we end with more headroom, and it's less fighting in the end to try to figure out what's, causing us to have some impact, too much impact on the master fader or whatever. But the other thing is that the way that I accomplish this, and when we're mixing and working on something that's already completed, it's a little bit more difficult. But to carry this mindset into your next thing that you're working on is to think about working with that type of headroom from the beginning, which means as I'm working, just starting the creative process, I'll take a look at the headroom on my master fader when I bring in a kick drum or when I start programming a kick drum, and make some output levels of the actual virtual instrument so that my fader can stay at 0 and my master fader has some headroom, right? And then the next sound I bring in, sort of, bring the output down of the instrument so that I still have that headroom. And as I bring in a sample, bring the gain down so I still have that headroom. And so I'm thinking about that all the way from the beginning. The reason that, or how I want to do this is at the first point of audio. So the output of whatever the virtual instrument is, because the next thing that's going to come is whatever processing that I'm putting, whatever compressor or EQ or saturator that comes. I'm going to have. I'm starting my proper um, gain staging from the first point of audio. So if I drop in a sample, I'll adjust the gain on it so that I make sure that I've got some headroom to work and continue to work. Now, the next piece of this that is helpful is not just thinking about the future, like I said, and having the type of ending headroom that's valuable for when we get into mastering, but also in mixing. There's a whole lot of options nowadays of plugins that are modeled after and made to sound like some vintage gear, analog compressors and EQs, and the like, right? Um, I know already a couple of people have mentioned they use universal audio interfaces. So there's those plugins, but there's a whole plethora of Waves plugins and of all different manufacturers plugins that many of us will use. Um, that good or 1 second? Okay, good. All right, cool. Okay, good. Okay, sorry, Moon. What was the last part of that question?
So since you're thinking about headroom in your
Yeah.
final, how low, what is your ideal dB on each instrument?
Each instrument isn't where the headroom matters. Where it matters is on my master fader. So I'm not trying to do 12 dBs of headroom on every instrument. I'm trying to do 12 dBs of headroom on my master fader, which is going to change as I add more and more, more and more and more and more pieces, right? Because more elements hitting my master will make it louder, right? So what I'm shooting for is I look at this number here. So when I play back a song, I'm shooting to try to have this about 12 dBs of headroom. What that's going to mean is that all of these individual pieces are going to be a bit lower. So in other words, that first point of audio is going to be a bit lower. Then when I go into, adding my plugins, whatever plugins I'm adding, an EQ, like whatever. And so the idea here is that like it's setting myself up for success later on if I'm going to be entering the realm of dealing with some of the analog plugins and some of the other esoteric plugins that we have, but it's not going to detrimentally affect the digital plugins or the some of the stock Ableton plugins that were designed in the digital realm and that don't necessarily they're not trying to like emulate and model outboard analog gear. So it's not going to detrimentally affect those by having more headroom. But if you were going to use some of the other stuff, it will help you in that regard because they're designed to work with a lower level. So if you can imagine, cramming 18 dBs more to an analog hardware piece, it might not sound as good as if optimize that level. And in other words, optimize your gain staging. So, that's that one step. But the main step is that so that when I'm finished with the mix and then I'm going to start to master it, I've got that headroom to work. So if I start to make some changes to the EQ, start to add, some different other processing, maybe do some saturation to the whole mix, or whatever the case may be, is the mastering engineer is going to have some room to work. So it's sort of this twofold benefit that the potential for having a lower level to pass through plugin to plugin Proper gain staging from the beginning to end helps leave that room at the end so that you can just sort of never really have to worry and just know that you're going to have a good amount of headroom in the end. If you start with 12 and you build the mix up a little, you end up with 10 or 9, no mastering engineer is going to complain about that. But if you start with 5 or 6 dBs of headroom and then you build your mix and you end up with 1, or if you're clipping even, now we have a problem. So anyway, so that's the idea about me being a proponent of headroom and its impact. So again, when I think about what was happening in the analog world, if we look at an analog meter, 0 dB on an analog meter is um, it's equal to, like I was saying, about, well, +4 on an analog meter. So here we see 0, but if we were at +4 on an analog meter, that's equal to -18 in the digital realm. So again, the idea is that like we're going to take that into consideration. We're going to shoot to have a little bit more headroom for the potential benefit of plug-in to plug-in proper gain staging, potential benefit of, as you expand your arsenal of plugins, some already have some of these analog designed modeled plugins, but also it's just setting you up for success on your master for when you then move into mastering. It gives you a little bit of headroom to work. So it sort of works over a couple of different planes, and it's just helpful to be able to do that. One of the things that I've definitely noticed is that the more headroom I have on my master, the well, in recent years, it's a little less of a case because most mix buses now have 64-bit of math, and so they're able to absorb a lot and do the math properly to fit it all on your master fader. But back in the early days, it definitely, the more headroom I had on my master, really had a more open and more sound, a more open sound to the final result. So it was less crunchy, I guess, in a sense, in a subtle way. But um, anyway, I sort of carry that old school mindset forward, coming from the analog days, looking at the way digital works, the way analog works, and the combination that we have nowadays with some of these analog plugins. I definitely take a mindset of, having some headroom. If I'm looking at my master fader and it's bouncing somewhere around here, then I know that gives me a little bit of room to grow, to finish the mix with a little bit less than 12 dBs of headroom, maybe 10, still be able to just sort of like, continue to just work and not have to worry about my headroom type of thing. I mean, I just had a mastering job come in yesterday where the guy was like, "Oh, I got to resend it to you. I just looked at my master and it's clipping." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, that's not good. So rebalance your mix so that you're not sending me a file that I'm supposed to master that's already in the red or clipping." So anyway, so that's the idea behind that. And when I talk about uh, going through this process of doing some basic releveling, when I'm thinking like a mix engineer to really sort of compartmentalize my workflow, is I'm doing this, and I sort of gave a little bit of idea earlier where I was talking about how I sort of do this in like groups. And because the creative part is done and all those groups interaction to one another is finished, and I've already added all the different drum parts, and I've already added all the different bass parts and subs or whatever, and all the different key parts and vocal parts, I sort of compartmentalize those and do that rebalance, right? And it doesn't take very long. It's usually like I find myself going, okay, it's time to mix this. I'll just turn off all the tracks and start to turn them on. Kick, clap, hat, drum loop. Oh, that drum loop feels a little low. Turn it up. Next drum loop, yeah, turn that up. This third, whatever, ride cymbal. Oh, that feels a little loud. Stuff that I didn't notice before because I was just sort of adding and moving around and thinking of different things. It can sort of, just a dB or two change across a few pieces can really help to sort of rebalance a mix in a positive way. And I do this amongst those groups. So I'll start with the kick. The drum, usually one of the loudest elements is the kick in what we're working on today. Make sure my headroom is good, then bring in the rest of the drums and sort of rebalance a little if needed. Sometimes they just are perfect, but sometimes I go, oh, you know what? Let me bring that down or up a little. And then grab the basses, the keys, vocals, and effects I do last. And this is the way that I sort of group them really quickly as I'm just sort of working. And this is the way I would do it when I receive stems if I'm, actually mixing. And I would just, start to look at all the different names and start with getting all the drums and re-leveling a little, and then do re-level the basses and the keys, and monitoring my headroom all the way. And just very quickly, I can get a little bit better sounding mix just by putting a little bit of that intention to each individual category or group and just sort of re-leveling within those and then re-leveling them all to one another just by taking a piece by piece slow approach to rebalance it. So it's a very useful trick to be able to do it. And I mentioned already a couple of times that I turn off all the tracks. So like if I was going to do this mix, like turning off all the tracks to start, and then I would start by bringing in one, bringing in another, bringing in another. And once I get to the point where I brought in a whole bunch and I'm now adding in this, whatever, the 30th track, sometimes it's a little hard to hear what's going on. And so I can still solo this track because the rest of the tracks are off. Solo still becomes a valuable tool. If I started by just soloing one by one and building my solos, right, and going, oh, cool, cool, all right, that sounds good, re-level, that sounds good, that sounds good. What part is this? Huh? What is that? It's hard because I've already, you know what I mean? I have to clear all the solos and go back. So it's just a little workflow tip that's helpful. I turn all the tracks off and then turn them on one by one, and I still retain the benefit of being able to solo as I'm going if I need to. So, all right. So that's just a quick little rebalance tip that has become useful, especially if I'm fighting for a mix. And it can be valuable to just sort of take that step back and think like a mixing engineer. Like we've done the creative part. You feel like it's the arrangements there. You feel like everything's good to go. And even if you're not 100%, but just sort of saying, all right, let me just take a step back and think like a mix engineer, do a little bit of this rebalance and see what happens. And along the way, while I'm doing that, I will think about a couple of different areas that retain or pertain to the stereo field. So I'll think about how these parts, when I'm bringing them in, feel on a left to right basis, right? And reevaluate some of that. I may have in the creative process brought in a synth and panned it a certain way, or brought in another synth and panned it a certain way, and then brought in another one that had inherent panning in it some way, and didn't necessarily pay too close attention to that, but I was in the creative mindset and I like the sound. So this gives us a chance to really sort of reevaluate that. One of the things that I think about in this uh, process, the easy part is taking a look at the movement left to right and the normal pan that we've been using before. Um, but the way that you've probably heard about this. There's lots of talk on the internet about it, but the way that the pan knob works in Ableton, and this is just a technical thing to kind of understand how it works, is officially it's sort of known as what's called a balance knob. So you have the two stereo signals, and that knob, when you move it left or right, sort of balances the left and the right. Right. So it's a balance knob, and normally a balance knob works fine if I'm just trying to balance something and move it and accentuate the right side, accentuate the left side. But there is one more avenue that we can do in evaluating the stereo field on an instrument as we're working, and that's we can activate what's called this split stereo pan mode, which gives us the ability to move the left and the right pieces of information separately. So if we right click on this and do show split stereo, now I've got the left I can pan wherever, I've got the right I can pan wherever, right? Now, in most normal operations, most mixes, I might, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that. And, balance works just fine. Where this becomes sometimes useful is when I think about this idea that the sound choices of today, whether it's the stock instruments, the samples we have, the virtual instruments that are the plethora of content that's available for us to use to create today, all of this stuff is nowadays made to be really pleasing, really warm sounding, really bright sounding, full of effects, full of stereo information with, lots of interesting things going on, which is totally awesome, especially when I'm scrolling through and looking for this pad and synth sound and this lead and this bass and this, whatever hi-hat sample and whatever the case may be. Occasionally what happens I've found nowadays is that I end up to a point where I've got too many pieces that are just all so wide that potentially it starts to lose the impact because there's so much stuff wide. So in more later, the last few years, it's been good for me to kind of think about where things are sitting and not just take for granted the width that is inherent in the sound I chose. So that's where this becomes handy because here's an example. Like let's say we've got a pad, another keyboard part, and a lead all of which come from the type of synth that are very rich in dimension and depth, chorusing, auto panners, stereo delays, which sounded great when we were scrolling through the sound. And now we have three different sounds that are all kind of meant to work together, that are all doing a whole lot of very stereo things. What can often be useful is, for example, maybe I take the lead and bring in the stereo field on the lead a little bit. And so I've got all of these things working out here, and then I take my lead and sort of have it work within this realm, and I can get a little bit more distinction out of it. So that's the reason why I showed this, because it can sometimes be useful um, when evaluating what's happening left to right and thinking, uh, if I have a whole bunch of stuff that is already very rich in stereo information, it can sometimes put some distinctness on a particular part if I sort of bring that in a little bit. And to me, it's a new phenomenon, because it's only in the more recent years where sounds have even gotten to the point uh, where they are that wide consistently. Like the sound designers are all competing for our attention to get us to choose their sound, their instrument, or whatever, and they make them very rich and wonderful for us. But sometimes it can cause a bit of a problem. So I just put that in there as a reminder to think about. And it's the type of a thing, like I said, where if I feel like I've got these elements, but my mindset says to me, it's like they just sound all too clumped together. Like, how can I get them to stand out a little bit? Sure, there's frequency things, but also think about what's happening across the stereo field. This can be a nice, simple way that says, oh, that's now standing out a little bit more because I sort of moved it away from all the other stuff that was happening. And with that same thing in mind, potentially there's something where you might want to add a little bit more stereo-ness to it. There's lots of tools nowadays for us to be able to do that. There's another area that I think about, and that's this low frequency containment. In the context of the stereo field, low frequencies we want to make sure that are not stereo. Low frequencies, by the nature of them, travel around the room in a non-directional sort of way. They don't have a relationship between the left and the right. They sort of emulate everywhere, and you feel the bass. If you think about a home stereo system, there's two speakers and one sub usually, right? Even if there's a whole bunch of other speakers, a 7.1, or whatever, like you have a whole bunch of speakers, left, right, front, back, but usually just one sub. Well, there's just a physical reason for that, because the low end travels kind of equally everywhere, and so you feel the low end. So with that in mind, we know that most sound systems are going to be, uh, in essence, monitoring the low end, so we prepare for that. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the low end and the containment, and making sure that the low end is mono. Again, we're thinking about the stereo field at this stage of sort of putting a little bit of intention to rebalancing the mix, thinking about the left to right balance and the volume up and down balance. And the one thing to consider is the elements that are in the low end. We want to make sure that they're nice and contained, and so we work on that. So these are a couple different areas when I think about this left to right, or the stereo information, when I'm really being critical about really trying to mix something super dope, right? So uh, I showed the pan knob. All right, so sometimes we want a little bit of a wider stereo image. There's lots of cool plugins out there that do that. A chorus, especially when it's on synth stuff, is awesome. And it's the big part of the way the Juno 106 is so well respected. It just had an amazing chorus on it, which they then even turned into a hardware box. But you have lots of different plugins from all kinds of people that can help to do that. This is just a simple little trick. If you feel like you do want a sound to have more spread to it, to actually take the opposite approach of what I was saying, where I was initially talking about some sounds that need to narrow the stereo field. But if you have something you want to create more 3D sound or add some dimension to, this is just a simple little trick that's very easy to set up using the stock digital EQ, and the settings are in here. The important part is that we turn off feedback, set this up with 15 milliseconds on one, 30 milliseconds on the other, and then mix it in just a little bit. Um, you can try this on your own. This is just a sort of tip I threw in there because it's really quick and really easy, and it's very nice to put a little bit of 3D-ness on something. So, sometimes we are using sound sources that aren't necessarily rich. combined with maybe other virtual instruments that are very rich in stereo field, and so they may feel a little bit different or out of place. So we may want to put a little bit of stereo information on a certain synth or a certain drum pattern or certain drum loop or something. And so this is a handy little tip to work on. I talked about the narrowing of the stereo image and why today, a little bit more and more, it's important to sort of think about that. Just that simple perspective of the sound designers of today are making stuff sound really awesome. So we use their instruments. And so I've just, noticed that I've had to spend a little bit more time sort of thinking about maybe positioning things in a little bit and how that works. Now, when I think about the low frequency containment, when I talked about that low end being mono, uh, the most recent version with this utility, most recent version of Ableton with this utility, this is the preset for bass mono, but the utility itself just has this bass mono section built in. And I know there's at least one of you out there using Logic, and in the directional mixer, it's got the same type of thing. So it's a way that it's a quick little utility that can make sure that the low end is nice and contained and monoed, and you can set the frequency. It defaults to 120. So if I just show this really quickly, let's say, what do I got? Like this bass. If I take the utility and put it in without even using that preset, the bass mono, when I click this bass mono, the default frequency is 120. And I find that that works pretty cool. Like in mastering, I set that at 90. Sometimes I'll finesse this around depending on the sound, but 120 is a good, starting point. Now, real quick theory behind that is that most subs have a cutoff frequency where they mono below 80 hertz. So this is set at 120 so that the filters that they're using are doing a pretty good job of monoing by the time it reaches 80, right? So that's the idea behind it. I think that why they set that default to be 120. That's a pretty good starting point. You can finesse that a little bit as you see fit. But it's a really quick and easy way to be able to go, okay, cool. The low end pieces that I want to be contributing to the low end, I want to make sure just sort of safety net them and make sure that they're nice and mono, so there's nothing weird happening stereo to just set myself up for success when it's played back on multiple other systems. And I've noticed there's a lot of stereo information on basses more and more today. Nexus 2 is a big instrument that a lot of people use because it has, intricate sound design of amazing sounds. It's not necessarily a full-fledged synth, but it comes with great content. But a lot of their basses are really wide, and so I'm using this a lot if I use that instrument. But a lot of instruments today are we're seeing some of that. So here's my safety net to sort of get through that monoing up the low end. The next step of this low frequency containment is thinking about the removal of the unintended low frequencies. Now, I've been talking really fast because I wanted to get to this part because this is a really important part of creating a more solid and contained low end, right? So when I think about what happens below 150 hertz, 120 hertz, it's like this is the VIP room of the entire mix. Not everyone is allowed in. Only the people that you want there are there. It's for the cool people. It's only for the ones that are supposed to be there, that are going to contribute to the vibe. Everyone else has got to go. So the idea here is that the low end information, like when you look at a frequency analyzer, and I'm sure you've all looked at EQ8 playing a full song through Ableton, you see the way the low end moves and the way it takes up a lot of space, whereas the high end moves a little bit closer together and faster, right? So the low end takes up a lot of energy. It takes up a lot of time. It takes up a lot of volume, basically. And so for the things that I do want there, I want to make sure that they can do what they need to do without being potentially clouded by a little bit of extra low end from a bunch of other tracks. Now, in my song, I usually have one, two, three tracks that are designed to contribute to that low frequency, right? A sub, maybe a bass also, and maybe a kick. But the rest of the stuff, it's usually not its intention to contribute below 100 hertz, right? So I want to make sure that any inadvertent leftover information that's there on all those other pieces, I sort of get that out of the way. And what that immediately starts to do is sort of has this tightening effect on the stuff that is supposed to be there. Now, this isn't this is a tool that I learned early on, and I teach this, and there's millions of people that will tell you this, online. It's a very valuable thing, how to get that tightness on the low end. Unfortunately, every track we do is a moving target, so like knowing this information can help you achieve it, but it's not like all you got to do is remove the low end out of everything and every song will sound dope. Every class I do, I start off with the semester, every workshop or tutoring type scenarios, and I'll ask people like, well, what are some of the things you're wanting to learn, or what are you looking forward to learning, or what are some of your problems you think? And 9 times out of 10, I get, getting my kick and bass right, right. Like I'm sure we can all relate to that. Like the low end is always going to be a problem. I still am doing multiple revisions on a mix to make sure that I get my low end right. It's always going to be a problem, but these are some things that we can do to kind of um, help us along the way. Now, if I give you just a really quick example of the usefulness in this, you're not going to necessarily be able to tell the difference, but I'm going to just sort of show you. So this is just a synth part here, and if I solo it, it's a synth part. We see a ton of movement below 100 hertz on this synth. Now, if this synth was playing in solo and, nothing else was happening, then I wouldn't mind that movement. But this synth is playing with a whole bunch of other elements, including kicks, including a bass, including a sub, right? So there's like other things going on there. So we can clearly see that there's a lot of movement. That's just one of my tracks. Now, a lot of the others don't necessarily have it, but let's see, does this tambourine have extra low end information in it? No, because I already did it. This is a stem, so it's already cleaned up. But you'd be surprised if you go through some of your mixes where you've got some drum samples and sounds, and you'll see movement happening below 100. Now, like I said, I only really have three main elements that I know their goal is to contribute in that range. But potentially, I've got a whole bunch of other tracks that are, acting in there a little bit, right? This track here has a whole bunch of stems, about 30, 40 different stems, right? So potentially, we have a little bit of contributing information in this frequency range that we know we're sort of really just want for those main elements. If we think about that VIP room, and so I want to make sure that I kind of get that stuff out of the way. How I do that is by just using a filter, using a high pass or a low cut filter. Old school, I call it a high pass. Some people call it a low cut. But if we look at the way that I have this set up here, I brought this up to about 108 because this particular sound does have some low end. I still want to clean up this 60, 50, 40 hertz area. I want to make sure there's not anything combating what's going on with my kick and my bass. And so I can just sort of use this filter. Now, this default filter here is a 12 dB slope filter. So really quickly, what does 12 dB slope filter means? It basically means that over the course of one octave, the gain will be reduced by 12 dBs. Okay, but JJ, I'm not playing piano, I'm mixing. What do you mean by octave, right? Okay, so if you think about a piano, think about the tuning of a piano, A 440 hertz, the tuning of a piano. You tune that to a frequency. That frequency is the frequency when we think about mixing, 440 hertz. An octave below that A is 220. It's half of that frequency. One octave is half of that frequency. So that's the equivalent of notes, right? Pianos, right? But one octave is also half of the frequency. So in context of a mixing scenario and a 12 dB slope filter, if I set that at 108, half of that frequency is an octave below. So at 54 hertz, I will be 12 dBs down. So a 12 dB slope filter is taking 12 dBs away over the course of one octave. And an octave in a frequency EQ scenario is half the frequency or double the frequency. So if I'm up here, I think about, what's happening at a 4K, uh, 12 dB slope high cut filter. It's 12 dBs down by the time it reaches 8K, double the frequency, right? And we can sort of see that equivalent, right? Now, when I'm doing this low end removal, that the goal here is to kind of clean up and create that VIP room, like I'm kicking everybody out so that my main elements I want in my low end have the room to work. I'm just using a 12 dB slope filter. Um, we do have the choice to do this times 4 filter. So now that I've explained that it's a 12 dB slope filter and what those numbers mean, a times 4 filter is what? 48 dB slope filter. What do those numbers mean? That means that over the course of one octave, it's 48 dBs down. Now just think about that in terms of your familiarity with gain, right? 12 dBs of gain is a pretty decent amount. 48 dBs of gain is a lot. It's very drastic. Now, when I'm talking about doing this filtering, using this high pass filter with 12 dBs, where in this particular sound I set it there, it's a smoother arching off. It's a smoother takeaway. It's 12 dBs down, and as a result, to me, it sounds less synthetic. So I usually am using a 12 dB slope filter, and it just works. Now, when I think about this, is like SSL, API, Neve, all of these consoles that made thousands of records that are cost $1 million and that sit in rooms that have the magazines. Every channel on those boards has a filter on it, a high and low pass filter, and all of those boards have a 12 dB slope filter. So the bass removal, the low end removal or high end removal if needed, on consoles that are worth this type of money that have made hit after hit, record after record for generations, use 12 dB slope filters. They're probably going to work fine with my little fucking electronic music I'm trying to do here today, right? So there's, it's perfectly capable to do that and to use those. And I think that they, again, my evaluation of it is that when I'm doing this low end removal across a whole bunch of tracks using a 12 dB slope filter, it's a more gentle approach, and therefore the that cutoff point that I'm setting for everything is going to sound more natural. It sounds less synthetic when I'm using this smoother, tried and true, tested 12 dB slope filter. So in most cases, when I'm setting this is, setting it in, where did I put that up here a little bit? I think I said, yeah, somewhere around 140 to 300 hertz. Most of the time I end up somewhere in this range from 150 to 200. Now, when I think about that, I know that like if I set it at 170, let's say, we know that we'll be 12 dBs down by 85 and 24 dBs down by 43. So right in here, when we get to 50, 60, 70 hertz, 40 hertz, we know I've got made sure I've got plenty of removal in there so that my sub and my kick and the things that I do want to create that movement down in that frequency have plenty of room to work within their own rhythm, work within how I intended them, and make that, to put some nice, way of getting your bass and kick to sound really good together. Step one is getting rid of all the stuff that was inadvertently contributing down there. So you just pay attention to it. Now, when I'm setting it, because some people have become confused when I say, well, where do I set it? Where. So I sort of gave you a little bit of this outline of where I kind of usually end up, right around in here. And then I say here, like, if I'm working on a hi hat and I'm filtering it out and I end up bringing this up to 300, like, this is the part I'm worried about. I'm only really worried about what's going on down here. So I don't futz around with this too much. Like, if I put this on a hi hat that, in this case, that isn't there, but let's just say there was a bunch of extra low information and I wanted to get rid of it. So I set my little filter and I bring it up, and it's like, it still sounds good. Like, I don't spend too much time worrying about this because I know my job here is to make sure this is clear. That makes sense? So it's not something that's going to take a lot of time. I'm going to put this on and go, okay, cool, we're good. In most cases, I'll just see this and be like, okay, well, I already did that to this. Or it wasn't there and wasn't needed, wasn't necessary. Cool. But oftentimes you will find pieces that it does need a little bit more. It does need a little bit of extra for that. So again, the setting of it is like once I get it to the point where I've already kind of gotten rid of what I want, I end up somewhere around this, 150, 170, 200 range on most higher end sounds, then I'm good to go. So we talked about setting up this base mono for the things that we do want there, and the why about that is pretty clear in that. So all right, so um, now we have the opportunity to really dive into some more of your questions. I talked even faster than I thought and ended a little bit earlier than I thought, but maybe now we can have some nice interaction that puts some context to maybe some of the things I went over kind of fast. So if there's any thoughts or ideas on this for today's lesson, now's your chance.
So somebody in the chat said that when production is finished, do you recommend starting to mix and master in the same Ableton project? And I would like to echo that question.
Yeah, I think all of that just depends on your workflow and your familiarity with it and all of that. I mean, the reality is the way that we're working today, we usually don't have that separation. So I'm just trying to offer some insights to help create some of that separation just in mindset and in thinking and offer some tips on how to do that. Now, you know, ideally, when I'm asked to mix for someone, they're going to send me stems and I'm going to be able to do everything I said today on that step by step compartmentalized basis. In my own work, I'm usually not doing that. I'm usually trying, in the interest of expediency, trying to just sort of keep working. Now, when it comes to mastering, I'm usually often wanting to separate that. So I might have some rough mastering stuff on my master while I'm mixing, but then oftentimes I'll like to sort of like zero that out, bounce a raw mix, and then really focus on a mastering session. So I definitely recommend doing that. But if I go through the active sessions I have right now, I've got several that are done that way, where I'm going to just make a mix and then do a proper mastering session. And I've got several where I'm doing mastering right in there. So, we're kind of, doing it all as we go, as we do. Um, you know, it's really, I'm not going to tell you to do it one way or the other because we kind of all have to work the way that we do. I think that thinking about some of the concepts that I talked about today in with the mixing mindset when you feel like you're ready to do that can be helpful. And that can be helpful whether you bounce stems and start a new mix session, or it can be helpful when you're just, still in the same session. And I think that's the important part, is to think about some potential rebalancing if you're having problems with the mix. Think about where things are sitting left to right and create some space there. Low end removal to make sure that you've got the room, that VIP room is ready and willing and able, monoing out the low end parts that are supposed to be there. And those initial steps can help get, where you want to be. I talked about headroom earlier, and someone put the question in there. When you say 12 dBs of headroom, should the master fader be at 0 with a peak of -12? Yes, that's exactly what you want. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you're using SonarWorks, which I was a huge proponent of and talked about yesterday, oftentimes SonarWorks has a little bit of level thing going on here because it's EQing your signal. And so in order to, let's see here, if I do this and I turn on this safe headroom, we'll notice that it brought the gain down by 7.6 dB to compensate for the gain boost it's doing on my correction. If we look at just the correction, so this is the EQ that it's applying. It's putting a whole bunch of low end in and putting some of this mid range in. And so we have, we're taking some gain away here. So when I'm monitoring headroom, I want to make sure that I have everything off on my master fader that can potentially show me a different number here. But basically, yes, with my master fader at 0, I want this number to be -12. And if it looks pretty good, then I can go ahead and turn on SonarWorks and then start to actually mix. Does that make sense? Um, Mike, you have a question?
Yo,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yeah,
Uh, I notice on a lot of plugins, it's if you have like a mono signal, let's say a bass line, um, when you start to add plugins, it'll say, do you want to add that plugin in dual mono, or it'll give you like different options. Like if it's mono,
sure.
the signal, what should I be aiming to? I know it's kind of like a general question, but it, like, does that make sense? It says
It
like,
does, yeah, because that's. I know you use Logic, so in there,
okay, is that a
yeah.
Logic thing? Sorry.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
sort of. It's also a Pro Tools thing. It's just not. It's a little bit more ambiguous in an Ableton world, but in the Logic realm, yeah. So you clearly have that choice of multiple, whether it's stereo or mono. Ableton kind of does that for you based on the track definition, right? But
Yeah.
if your track in the basic difference here is that if you're when your choice is multiple mono, it's basically giving you two of those plugins, one that's for the left side, one that's for the right side, and oftentimes you can link them or you can have them separate.
Right.
So
I
it's
know,
sort of like
like
having
couple
two
them.
compressors set differently for one side or the other. Usually they're linked by default, but they're interacting separately to the side, to the difference left and the right. But if you have just a mono plugin, which would be your choice if your track was defined as just mono, that is what you would use. If you had a mono track, you would just put a mono plugin on and everything's fine. When
Like
you
a
have
kick drum.
like, right, but some kick drums are going to be stereo. But if you're from your 909
Right.
come in on a mono track, yeah, you're just going to use a mono compressor because there's only mono information to deal with. It's the same in the left and the right is what mono is. It's the same in the left and the right. You're still going to hear out of your master information out of the left and the right. It's just exactly the same. So in essence, it's defined as it's only a mono track. It's just sending everything equally out both, right? That make sense?
Yeah, but then why is it when I record it in, I could like when I record in something from, let's say, a drum machine, a mono kick, why is it that I have to make it into stereo so that I could hear it from on both sides? Like that's not, and it's not true. That's not true stereo, right? That's just, I'm
Right.
confused.
You shouldn't have to. If you record a mono sound to a mono instrument or mono track, it's going to come out both sides. So there's something set up differently in your inputs or something. But
Okay.
by definition, it wouldn't, a mono signal is going to come evenly out both sides. So there should be no change there. Something's happening that maybe we could do a private lesson and figure out. But
Okay.
yeah.
And also, can you drop the this one's for, I think, Nick. Could you drop is there like a discount for the Sonar Works that with the Academy, or for that? Okay. 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 Thank you.
We did have it previously, so I don't know if he's lined it up for this. But yeah, check with Adam and see what he says on that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we got another question. When does mixing end and when does mastering start? I'm not too clear on the difference between mixing and mastering. An example would be helpful. Um, so mixing ends when, I mean, it's hard to answer that because mixing ends when I feel like it sounds the way I want it. From there, then it's about, and I guess the it if I explain this and compartmentalize it in the mindset of the sort of old school way of working that I had mentioned earlier, where there was three different professionals, right? We have the tracking engineer who worked with the producer and the band, and that's the equivalent of our the modern day producers, sound design. That's where the creative process for us, right? That's where we're choosing different sounds, we're making them sound weird or however we want, and doing our rhythmic elements and programming drums and doing all of that. Then we had the sort of mix engineer who came in next on that project that took all of those individual pieces that were made to sound however they were made to sound, odd, weird, cool, or just clear. And then he then mixed them all and really made them all sound good together as a group. And made some subtle adjustments to the level and how it all worked, how the vocals sat, the extra compression, and made the song itself now really feel like a finished product. And then that got sent to the mastering engineer, and the mastering engineer's job was to now do whatever final tweaks and polish and icing on this particular song so that it then translates out into the real world, that it sounds loud, that it sounds clear, that it sounds good across multiple sound systems, multiple speakers, and multiple environments. And those were the three professionals who were involved from A, B, and C along. And now we're wearing all those hats. So if I think about that as a definition, that sort of helps guide me when I'm taking that process on my own stuff. So the creative process seems to be done. Usually I'm doing the creative process and the mixing at the same time. But when I get to a point where I feel like my creative process is done, I sort of do a little bit of a switch in my mind. I make sure that, I've got as much of my elements, kind of solidified and as audio that I want or whatever. And then I start to think a little bit more like the way the mixing engineer is. Even though I'm still doing it a little bit in a cycle where I do creative mix, creative mix, creative mix, there does come a point where I feel like, all right, my arrangement's good, my programming is good, the flow is good, my parts are good. Now I just need to finalize making it all sound good. And that's where I start to shift into thinking like a mixing engineer, taking some of these initial steps, like I talked about, if I need to rebalance, all of that. And then I kind of am like, all right, I think this mix sounds as good as I can. That's when I would then take that next step and go, okay, cool. Now let me work as a mastering engineer and sort of print that, bounce it, bring that now into a mastering session, get some of those reference tracks that I talked about, really do some even more intricate listening between the reference tracks, comparing that to what I'm working on, and now just doing some subtle changes or not some subtle changes to really now sort of master that track and get it to fit even better with the outside world, in loudness and in frequency balance. And so that's kind of how I would explain it and how I would think about it. Now, delineation for you as to where those lines are is something I can't answer, but I know that for me, the way that I do is the way that I explain. Like I feel like my creative part is done, then I move on to thinking about mix. Not to say that I never go, oh, you know what, maybe another lead sound will sound good here. And sometimes I'll do that, but just to understand the three different pieces and the three different hats, and to sometimes be able to subtly just sort of put some focus on one of those hats is helpful. Another thing that's interesting to me is I heard this a long time ago, a phrase where creative endeavors are never finished or completed, they're just abandoned. So oftentimes it gets to a point where it's like, I could spend another couple of weeks working on this song and make it different. Is it going to be better? Maybe, maybe not. It'll be different, but is it good the way that it is? And oftentimes that's for creative professionals get to the point, people that have to work on deadlines and stuff. You just get to the point where you're like, yeah, I could still work on this, but it sounds good as it is. I'm happy with it. Maybe there's some areas I'm not sure what to do with, but this is the time that I've got to let this go. I've got to move on. So sometimes we run into that, but that's how I think about it. Another question: when you have a lot of drum tracks that sometimes cancel each other out, how do you help those frequencies from phasing each other? Um, yeah. So I run across that mostly with low end pieces. So I run across that mostly when I'm dealing with like a kick and a bass, for example, especially if my bass has lots of length and lots of low end, and my sub or bass has that as well. That they can potentially end up um, essentially out of phase and cancel each other out. When I think about higher end frequency stuff, where if I start to layer too many hi hats and they start to have sort of frequency masking slash phase cancellation, what's going on, I think that how I would approach that is to start to um, really evaluate more closely the frequency contribution I want from each individual element and put a little bit of focus there, and put a little bit of removal EQ or de-emphasis in some of the areas where my other parts I want that focus. So when I think about, let's say for an example, I've got a tambourine, a shaker, an open hat, a closed hat, and maybe another open hat for later in the song. and maybe a 16th note hat also, like that's a lot of high-end elements that are working. I might start to really sort of break down where I really want each piece to be and focus their frequencies there, and then think about the others and do a little bit of removal around those some other areas. So that can sort of help with there not be as much buildup and potential less interaction with the frequencies for high-end information. And then also sometimes I will take into account some of this panning stuff that I was talking about, where sometimes a little bit of moving across the stereo field of similar rhythmic elements, similar frequency contribution elements, and sort of move them a little bit away from each other can start to give them a little bit more separation and less fighting with the frequencies. Now, when it comes to the low end, that's a little bit harder. I just encountered this on a track I was working on where my kick and bass were starting to have some phase issues at certain times. Oh no, it was a track I was mastering. And so anyway, it was a stem thing. So I was able to literally adjust that audio file and move and sort of play with it and kind of move the start time so that the frequency waveform of the kick and the waveform of the bass were a little bit better aligned, and so they weren't canceling each other out. And so, one way that I might do that is if it's just a sample, is you can go into the sample editor, the audio editor, and sort of adjust the start point, and then see how that interacts and move it around and see if that sort of takes up or starts to have them get realigned or aligned in a different way.
Do you, I don't know if this matters, but I produce techno, so there's like
Yep.
a lot of drums and bass, and that's where I'm having the issue. So moving the gain on them has nothing to do with it, or sidechaining them. Would that help, or is it just literally going in and cleaning up all the frequencies by themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of all of that. Like, so to me, all right, so I'm gonna sidechaining to me is a creative tool and a last resort mix problem solver. When you do any sort of search on YouTube for making techno, the first thing they're going to say is sidechain, sidechain, sidechain. Cool, all right, great, I get it, it's easy, right? But I take the hard road and always try to make sure that my kick and bass and low end elements work the best they can together. And then if I want to add that creatively, I'll add that in and it'll sound even better, right? So rather than relying on it, I use it as a tool, but not relying on it. So getting my kick and bass together is definitely making sure that they're phase aligned and tuned. That's another thing, is oftentimes we're actually going to talk about this when we get into EQ tomorrow a little bit, where I talk about dealing with the low end in terms of the emphasis frequencies or tuning. It's a little bit less like tuning a higher note that has a very distinct narrow frequency, whereas because the low end is taking up such a large amount of room that even if we pull in a tuned kick at say A, which is 55 hertz, you'll see it moving all around from 80 to 40, right? So so sometimes what I'll do is emphasize the kick either at the root or somewhere different by putting a little bit of a boost on the EQ. Say if I was in the key of A, boost the kick at 55 just a little bit, like it's moving everywhere, but I can emphasize it a little bit at the key of the song. And then also I might think about where the bass is sitting, not just the rhythm, because the sidechain can take care of the rhythm. Like when they hit together, the sidechain will make sure that they're separate. But also when we have like if the kick is not emphasized or tuned correctly, and then the bass is playing a certain note, it's the equivalent of like hitting two notes right next together on the piano, where it starts to sound kind of weird. And so I would think about what the key of the song is, what the notes of the bass are, and think about that in its emphasis of the kick and emphasis of the bass. So if my approach is like, okay, I'm going to take the root and sort of boost a little bit of my kick at this 55, let's say, but my bass is playing 55 also a whole bunch, but it's also playing some other notes. Like I might dip a little bit at 55 on the bass or the sub, so that there's already one I know is going to be contributing that note. And so I can take a little bit of that frequency out of the bass, like a 2Q minus 3, it's minus 2, a 2Q plus 2 on the one or the other, puts a little 4 dB difference at just that frequency that potentially could be causing a problem. And that's a way for me to get some nice distinctness between the two when they're hitting together or separately, because those notes. Anyway, yeah. So that's one way of thinking about it also.
Thank you.
And then of course, adding the sidechain now rhythmically is going to make them work even better together. Now that becomes a creative thing, and it can help with the separation and clarity of the kick and the bass coming up in between and setting that correctly and all of that. But if you've already taken those steps to really evaluate the key, the emphasis, the frequency, the tuning or emphasis of the tuning, and doing that, as well as the level, as well as the low end removal, now you add the sidechain in it, and now you get those records that you hear when you have this crazy loud together separate sounding but very together sounding low end, and it's a combination of all that. Okay, so somebody says, so start with -12 with SonarWorks off and then turn it back on. Yeah, I think, basically it's just that when I take that step to really to evaluate my headroom, I want to make sure that there's nothing affecting that on the master. So if it's my first step, um, then yeah, I'll turn it off or whatever. But I mean, like, I don't have to turn it off because like I can also put a meter before and just use that. Like either way, we just want to just remember that like anything that's on the master fader that is affecting the signal will affect this number that we're looking at, right? It'll affect the headroom number that we're looking at. But for me, like I can use my favorite limiter that I don't think I have. Oh, wait, here it is. It opened up over here. I can just use my favorite limiter without any limiting or anything, but just look at the metering of it and set, for this particular tool, I can set it at -12 and look at where my input is. And in this particular case, it's before, let's see, I think I have something soloed somewhere, yeah. Yeah, so basically my point is that like you can just put a meter before SonarWorks and use that to evaluate. Like even one of these free ones that we were talking about, like this will tell me, because I can set it to tell me um, as a peak meter, right? Because we're using peak metering. We're taking a look at our peaks. We're not doing anything fancy. It's old school peak meters to determine headroom, because headroom is the difference in your peaks from 0 to where they are, right? And headroom is we say it as a positive number, but technically it's a negative number. It's like your peaks are at -10. That means I would say you've got 10 dBs of headroom. What that means is that your peaks are -10, right? That makes sense? So anyway, I can just use whatever metering. I've got a bunch of different meters that I might use to do that. Or if I'm taking that approach of just looking at the fader, then yeah, I just turn everything off on my master. This utility is just for you guys because it's kind of loud without it. But if I turn that off and look at where my headroom is on my master fader, it's going to be pretty loud, but that's the beginning of the song. Come on. So this mix, this is just a mix, a stems version of mix. There's no mastering, I don't really have any processing on my master fader. I've got about 9 dBs of headroom. Now that's what I was saying, how like I start with 12 and I can end up here. This is plenty to take me through to mastering. But I'm only getting an accurate picture of this number when I have everything off on my master. So once my headroom is cool and I know it's good to go, then I can turn on my SonarWorks and, just sort of make it happen from there. These numbers mean something because it's just a simple math too, right? Like I talked about how on my particular headphones, my safe headroom button, which is making sure that I'm not going to clip because of the EQ curve it's applying, is taking me down 7.6, right? So, okay, that volume is happening before my master fader. So with just a little bit of quick math in my head, I say, well, if I want to be about, say, 12 dBs of headroom, and this is also taking away 7.6, if I'm looking at about 19.6 here or so, then I'm going to have about 12 dBs of headroom, even with that on. So you just have to take that into account, what's happening, right? So now if I look at it, with SonarWorks on, I'm ending up at about 15 dBs of headroom because I was at 9 minus 7. So it's, the numbers are close, but that's how, like knowing that this is how much this is taking away, I can still make relevance of this number even with it on. But it's tricky when you first start to use it and start to think about headroom. It's easier to just turn everything off on the master, make sure your headroom is cool, adjust your faders, cool, turn SonarWorks on, and now really mix it, EQ it, and all that type of stuff. So, all right, one more question. Gain staging. What would you recommend setting your tracks to? Tracks is irrelevant. The tracks need to be where they need to be. What I want is the headroom on the master to be minus 12, right? So like if we look at where all of these tracks end up, like I just press play. So these numbers are showing me where they were. So this kick is actually at minus 11.7, which is probably my loudest part. And that's why my headroom is up about 9, the kick and the bass together. But like this other hi-hat is only hitting minus 22. Its peaks are minus 22. This snare is minus 19. This clap is minus 17. So I can't tell you where to put that. Like if I set each input to be minus 12 and press play, my mix would sound like crap. Like everything at the same level doesn't really make sense. But what does make sense is my mix sounding leveled how I want and my master fader not having not clipping, or in other words, my master fader having headroom. That's the important part. Does that make sense? Rico, did I answer your question? Yeah, cool, yeah. Yeah, so that's the important part. Any other things to discuss? Sure. At this stage of the process, I'm basically using the low cuts and filters. When I start to then want to shape the frequencies, when I'm actually kind of like mixing and adjusting how I want something to sit across the frequency spectrum, I do love using shelves, especially if I'm boosting. And we're actually gonna talk a little bit about that today, tomorrow when we kind of get into more applicable EQ settings and things that I do and frequencies. But yeah, usually at this stage, the idea is sort of getting that low end out of the way, creating some clarity for the stuff I want there, monoing the stuff that I want there on that for the lows, and then the rest of that shaping that's coming, I might use some shelves later on. The other piece about this which is interesting is that in fact maybe tomorrow we're going to talk about compression and dynamics. I think in EQ the next day, but um, this this idea of this sort of like step one mixing thing for today, which was that sort of potential rebalancing, thinking across the stereo spectrum, maybe some narrowing, maybe some balance or pan, then also the low end removal using the filters, the monoing the low end that you want there, like doing some basic leveling and really starting to put some shape to a mix with just these few simple little things. It also sets us up for the next steps where I'm starting to then apply some dynamic control and compression because I've gotten rid of any excess low end that is potentially going to trigger the compressor differently. So it's also sort of it's not just making sure that I clean up and make the room for the low end. It's also knowing that some of my next steps when I'm dealing with the dynamic control of a particular piece is going to be a little bit more refined to the frequencies that I actually want to address. So it sort of also takes into account what I'm going to do next. And again, this is my thinking in terms of like when I say like I'm thinking like a mix engineer. So the process here is more like me working when someone sends me stems, but the application is still valid when you conceptually think about what the goals are and how we're doing it, right? So like when I get the stems from someone, I go through this process that we sort of walk through today and sort of create this, rebalancing and panning and just sort of clean up low end and all that. I feel like, yeah, this mix is starting to take some shape. And now I think about where things are dynamically and I start to apply compressors and dynamic control elements to the pieces. I've already sort of done that low end cleanup, which will also help me set a compressor more precisely because I'll only be focusing on the frequencies that I know I'm going to want in the mix already, right? So I've already sort of gotten rid of this excess, potentially excess on some parts for the low end. Now, remember, I talked about how the low end takes up a lot of space and time. It moves over a long, long, long period. And even if it's just a little bit underneath, like we witnessed on one of that synth sound, where it had some movement of that low end, but potentially that information is gonna affect how I would set a compressor in if that's what I wanted to do later. So it sort of works across these two phases of setting me up for success or more intricate or more precise dynamic control and setting without that extra low end contributing. And it also makes sure that I've got nice cleanup and can put some nice containment in for the low end parts that I do want there without having this excess stuff coming underneath below. Um, and if we see how like kick and bass rhythmically kind of can do their working together, this is sort of a rhythm that I'm doing right now with my hand. And then we have the hat and we have the drum loop and we have the synth thing and we have all of that doing all different rhythms of there, but all having a little bit of excess low end going on. We can see how that's now going to potentially start to get. Oh, sorry, yeah, my hands aren't right. So we have this, little bits coming from a bunch of different pieces that's working on the low end down here, the stuff that we do have working up here, but they're going to be contradictory, right? So now I get rid of that, and now I can really get this nice solid low end. But again, so it also is going to help for the next step, which is when I start to apply some compression, I've gotten rid of that, long frequency, loud frequency, low end that in most of the sounds is not really necessary anyway. It's not its focus. It's not the goal I want from that sound. You know. Few minutes left for some more dialogue.
I
All
got a
right.
question.
Yes.
It's kind of a loaded question, but what about when you mix something from when you're bringing something into a session from, let's say, like a synth or whatever, like an electron synth that has like a wide stereo field, or chorus to it, and you like the effect, would you record the part with the effect? I mean, I
Yeah.
know your answer is you're gonna say dry, you're like dry all the time, but sometimes like I find
No.
myself going,
I mean, no, not really, because like if it's there and it's with and it sounds nice, cool. What I
reverb.
usually won't keep is space stuff like reverbs.
Okay.
So I usually will dumb those down in the synths themselves and then apply them via sends and all of that. And there's a whole different theory behind that. But if it's got the width spatially left to right, via chorus or whatever the sound is, yeah, I just record it as it is. The
Mhm.
other thing is like, you know, if you wanted to change it, you can go back and re-record it too,
Right,
so
right, right.
bringing stuff in from the outside world, a lot of times I'll leave it the way that it is. um, I will tend to dumb down any reverb stuff because I'll want to sort of really have that be more intentional for my song, my parts, my pieces. And but stereo wise, I'll sort of bring it in, especially because I know the way that I can. And in Logic is the same way. You right click and you can turn that balance knob, which is your pan knob, into individual left and right control. And so you
Mhm.
can sort of narrow the stereo field. In Pro Tools, you can, and in Ableton, we saw that, right? So uh, I'm going to bring it in with whatever width it has if I think it sounds nice. If I need to change that, I can. I can sort of narrow the stereo field. So,
Mm. Thanks.
yeah. So I'm curious if anyone, I know Mike did, but if anyone since yesterday who didn't have SonarWorks and sort of got the demo and their headphones were in there, was there anyone that was able to like grab the SonarWorks and mess with it and see, or
I did.
yeah? What were your thoughts?
Uh, it sounds great. I don't know that I really noticed that much of a difference, but I'm sure as I start mixing in, I'll probably start hearing more and more.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the interesting things for me, and this is kind of what sold me on it, is I got it, I ran some tests, I messed with it a little bit, and then I kind of looked at the EQ curves. And then what I did is I went back and I actually opened up a session, and I saw some stuff going on in my low end that was like peaks and dips that it was telling me. And so I went and like kind of looked in my EQ what I was doing to some of the stuff in the low end, and I was inadvertently doing the opposite, or the inversion of that. So like I was trying to make it sound like I wanted it, but what I was listening to was a dip there, and so I was boosting there, and I was like, holy shit, I'm actually like hearing it right, but what I'm hearing is wrong, and so I'm like EQing it to get it right, but like I'm fighting against what I was hearing. I was like, wow, this stuff is like, I literally was like, when I would make these mixes and I would play them out and I would think, oh, whatever, 200 hertz sounds too heavy. And then I would look at what I was doing in there. I was boosting it. And then when I looked at what SonarWorks was correcting, it was right there. And I'm like, wow, I think this is really going to be helpful. And that's like my first piece of using it before I started preaching it and making everybody I know use it, was just seeing how I was inadvertently making this correction to make stuff sound how I wanted it, but I was combating this, EQ curve that I was hearing that was invisible, but it was off. So it was pretty interesting to go back and take a look at like stuff that I knew sounded a certain way out in the outside world, comparing what I was doing to the mix and what SonarWorks would be yeah, fixing. And it was interesting comparison to see that dynamic across
So
finished stuff.
if you run a separate frequency, if I run a track that is just the drums, say, it would correct that frequency. It would tell me what would be wrong with the frequency, more or less.
Well, it's not necessarily telling you what's wrong. It's just allowing you. It's just fixing what you're hearing. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So it's and when you install it and you first put it on the plugin and it tells you, have it last in the chain, remember it's only for your listening environment, bypass it when you bounce. That's really important information. But the concept behind that is that it's just compensating for your environment.
yeah.
Like yeah, the question here is fixing for a flatter response. Yes, it's basically flattening out the frequency response so that the inherent discrepancy in EQ curve that's in a particular set of headphones or a particular set of speakers, particular room, whatever, it's sort of compensating for that, taking that into account. And like I said, this is the way those studios out of the magazines we looked at before we dreamed of making music one day. It's like those studios are calibrated, the majority of those, and certainly the mastering studios, they're calibrated. This just gives us that opportunity to pull that right into a pair of headphones at home and um, help us make way more informed decisions. But then it's only applicable to our listening on those headphones. We take it off, we bounce, and then we play it out into the world, and it'll sound way closer to the way that we intended, because we're not inadvertently EQing and leveling across a fake frequency, right? Like I was saying here, these headphones, they're pretty good headphones, you know, Sennheiser 600s, but that's the correction. So what I was listening to before is pretty light on the low end, light on this 2K to 3K range, a little heavy at 6K, pretty flat here, about 12K, a couple dBs. But this was like when I would mix in these headphones, I would mix with a lot of low end, a lot of sub, and too much mid range, 2K. So when I saw this and was like, this is exactly like when I evaluate my mixes and I would play them out, I would go, it's too subby and it's just kind of harsh in the mid range, you know? And then I saw this and it's like, well, it makes sense because what I was hearing was lacking low end and lacking mid range. So I was mixing, like I was doing the correction in my mixes. I was mixing with this and this. And then when I would play it out, this is what it would sound like. But now this is saying, all right, we're going to correct that so that what you're hearing is now this after. So the simulated after is like, now I'm hearing flat all the way across all these frequencies, just a tiny little boost here. But basically now, whatever I'm adjusting to any of these frequencies, it's going to be really relevant to what I'm hearing. And so I'm not inadvertently making a weird level or EQ change. So that when I then take this off and play it out, it's like going to sound, much better. So someone was saying, is there a true flat headphone for production? No, I don't think it exists. I don't think there is such a thing. Um, I mean, there's a whole lot of calibrations in here, and so they even have calibrations for headphones that are $2,000 and $3,000 and $4,000, and they're still calibrating something. They're still doing something to that. There's just I mean, one of the mastering places in San Francisco I'm really familiar with, Coast Mastering, has Focal stacked speakers in a really good sized room with amazing gear and amazing acoustic control. The speakers I think are $150,000 for a set with separate amps and all this crazy shit. Well, even that had to be tuned. Like there was still an interaction of those, the position of them, the room itself, the speakers themselves, and there was still that little fine tuning that happens with to really make it as flat as possible. So we're just able to now do that on stuff that wasn't that great to begin with and make it even better and flatter. All right. Good.
So I don't
Thanks.
use headphones at all.
Perfect.
Would I need to get the SonarWorks like Studio Edition, or would the head
Yes.
be?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the SonarWorks thing, it kind of comes, if you looked on the website, it's 3 packages. There's the Studio Edition that comes with the microphone. Then there's just the Studio Edition, which is the plug-in and and everything. And then there's just the headphone edition. Of course, the headphone edition is available even at the higher priced one with the microphone. But what I've done is I've shared the microphone across multiple people. Like, so, if you can afford the $300 version, when it goes on sale for $250, that includes the microphone. It's a modest amount, but it's not free, so that's something to consider. But if you know someone else that might want to do it, and you guys can share the mic, it cuts it down a little bit, right? So you could, one of you could get the mic, and like my mic's been in the closet since I calibrated last. So it's the type of thing that like it just sort of sits there. And I do recommend using their mic. They have some stuff on their website that like if you already have like a reference mic, it might work. But one of the cool things about when you buy the mic with them is they actually calibrate the mic. And so you import a calibration profile based on the mic, the serial number that you bought, so that when it's doing this evaluation and you're walking through the process of putting the mic in your room and listening to your speakers, it's like actually calibrated for the mic itself and then giving you a really accurate result. So it's worth it considering it's really only like $50-$60 to have this mic. And if you ever change your room, change your speakers, change your desk, you want to you just pull it out, run the software, it takes 20 minutes, you get another profile. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah. Yep, we're good. Just real quick recap. The things to make sure is to really focus on thinking about is the way that it's that low end, because obviously that's the thing we're always trying to fix and work on. And we do that step one by clearing out the room, making sure the stuff that isn't supposed to be there is out of the way, that the stuff that is there is all mono together. And that's our initial steps to really getting solid low end, because we're going to be striving for that our entire careers. So that's the big takeaway from today. The video should be up, the notes will be there, and we'll dive in further tomorrow. Thanks.